What in the world could a king from the Bible have in common with a predator from the headlines? Well, it turns out a lot more than you might think. Today, we're going to dissect a timeless and frankly disturbing pattern of how power corrupts and how systems fail by comparing two men separated by 3,000 years of history.
I know. On the surface, this comparison sounds kind of crazy, right? An Iron Age warrior king versus a master of 21st century global finance. But stick with me, because as we're about to see, their stories follow an almost identical blueprint for how powerful people fall and how the institutions around them let it happen. So, on one side, you've got Saul, the very first king of Israel, a figure straight out of ancient scripture. And on the other, Jeffrey Epstein, the disgraced financier whose crimes absolutely horrified the modern world. By putting their lives side by side, we can start to see how unchecked power doesn't just ruin one person, it has the power to rip apart the very fabric of society.
So, where does a story like this even begin? Well, it's not with some grand evil plan. It almost always starts in a moment of crisis. Both Saul and Epstein climbed to the top by taking advantage of a moment of profound systemic weakness, basically a void that they were perfectly built to fill.
The source material we're looking at calls this an institutional void, and it's a really critical concept. Just think of it like a power vacuum. The old ways of doing things, the old rules, they're just not working anymore, and people are desperate for someone, anyone, to offer a way forward. And that's the exact moment a charismatic and often dangerous leader can make their move.
And here's where the parallels just jump off the page. For Saul, the void was a massive national security threat. Israel's tribes were getting hammered by the Philistines and were about to fall apart. They needed a warrior king, and Saul, this tall, imposing military leader, was the perfect fit. Now for Epstein, the void was economic. He popped up in the Wild West of early global finance, offering a very special, very private service to the super rich who were trying to figure out this confusing new world of offshore money. So different crises, different eras, same dynamic. They had the answer when the system didn't.
Okay, so getting power is one thing. But holding on to it and then using it to build your own private world, that's a whole other ballgame. And that brings us to the next parallel. As soon as they got comfortable, both men started building these isolated spaces, little kingdoms really, designed to be completely beyond the reach of any kind of oversight.
You know, whether it's Saul's rugged remote fortress at Gibeah or Epstein's sun-soaked private island in the Caribbean, the whole point was exactly the same: to create a separate reality. A place where the normal rules of society and even the law just didn't apply. A world where they were the one and only authority.
And inside these private bubbles, their power became absolute. For Saul, his immunity came from being anointed by God himself. I mean, who's going to argue with that? For Epstein, it came from his insane wealth and his infamous black book of connections to the most powerful people on the planet. But the result was identical. They carved out a space where their darkest impulses could run wild, with no real threat of anyone stopping them. They were, for all intents and purposes, above the law.
And this is where the story gets really dark. We have to look at the psychology of what that kind of unchecked power actually does to a person. The source material argues that as their power ballooned, so did this deep, dangerous mental instability. It was a complete disintegration of their moral compass.
Now, the ancient text says King Saul was tormented by an evil spirit sent by God. This thing would cause him to fly into violent rages, become intensely paranoid, and sink into these deep, dark depressions. Some modern scholars look at that and say, hey, that sounds a lot like severe PTSD or combat trauma. But it's also just a really powerful metaphor for what happens to the human mind under the crushing weight of absolute power.
Okay, now fast forward 3,000 years. A psychological assessment of Jeffrey Epstein, done after his death, identified a profile that, while it uses the cold, clinical language of modern psychology, it echoes that exact same deep pathology. It's a personality profile called the Dark Triad, a toxic cocktail of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And the details of that assessment are just bone-chilling. We're talking about a personality defined by this grandiose sense of entitlement, a strategic and completely callous way of using people, and zero remorse. Just none. And all of it was hidden behind this carefully crafted mask of being a charming, intelligent guy.
And if you want one number that tells the whole story, it's this one: 16 out of 16. On the part of the psychopathy checklist that measures the core emotional and interpersonal deficits, things like empathy, guilt, emotional depth, Epstein scored a perfect 16. The analysis says this reflects a complete and total lack of empathy or any real connection to other human beings. It's a void where a conscience is supposed to be.
So when you have that kind of psychological makeup, and you're living in your own private kingdom, well, both men eventually got to a point where they acted like they were above the very laws, whether God's laws or man's laws, that governed everyone else. This is what the source material calls the sovereign exception. It's the moment you believe you are the law.
And you can see this sovereign exception play out in two pivotal moments in their stories. Two moments where the systems that were supposed to be a check on their power did the exact opposite. They bent the rules, and they gave them a pass.
First up, King Saul. He's facing a military disaster at a place called Gilgal, and he panics. He performs a religious sacrifice himself, something that only a priest was allowed to do. He basically usurped the authority of God, and the prophet Samuel's reaction was swift and brutal. You've been rejected. Your kingdom is over. He acted like the law didn't apply to him in a crisis, and he paid the ultimate price for it. And now for the chilling modern version of that story. In 2008, even with a mountain of evidence that he was sex trafficking minors, Jeffrey Epstein got that infamous non-prosecution agreement. This sweetheart deal, as it's been called, let him dodge serious federal charges. He ended up serving a short, comfy sentence in a county jail where he could leave for work every day. Once again, the system, when faced with a man with that much power and money, created an exception.
And all of this, these transgressions, these sovereign exceptions, it all leads us to the final and honestly the most important takeaway here. Because it is so tempting to just look at these men as monsters, as one-off freaks of nature. But the source material argues that if we do that, we are missing the real lesson and the real danger.
The argument is this: guys like Saul and Epstein aren't just flukes. They are products of the very systems they come from. They're like a mirror, reflecting all the cracks and all the weaknesses in our most trusted institutions.
This quote from the assessment just says it all, doesn't it? If Epstein was an operator, the system was his cover. He didn't just break the system, he was an expert at exploiting its built-in flaws. The way we bow down to extreme wealth, the way institutions get desperate for donations, and the glaring obvious weaknesses in our justice system. So in the end, their stories are this powerful, disturbing reflection. They show us how those institutional voids create the perfect opportunity for predators, how a culture of elite immunity shields them from consequences, and how they build these shadow states, fortresses, and private islands to operate in total secret, way beyond the law's reach. This isn't just about the psychology of a couple of bad guys, it's about the very architecture of power itself.
And all of this leaves us with one last, very provocative question. The fact that these parallels exist between an ancient king and a modern financier, that's not just an interesting historical footnote. It's a warning. It suggests the pattern of power abuse that's thousands of years old, and it just keeps repeating. So the real challenge for us, right now, isn't just to understand this pattern. It's to learn how to spot it when it shows up in our own time, and to find the courage to actually stop it.